let me say, right, I don't want this to be an argument with anybody. Then, you know what I mean? I don't want to be like, oh, God doesn't exist, bro. Why do you think that you're dumb? Or God exists, obviously he exists. If you think he doesn't, you're dumb. Like, you know what I mean? I don't want to get into that. But I do want to be logical and smart about choosing who I follow.
Into a bumper
So,
sticker. That
so,
simplicity is its downfall, however, as its fallacies are so blatant and its refutation resistance is so low that it
so
can
this
be and
one,
has been refuted by the likes of Homer Simpson.
And what if we pick the wrong religion? Every week we're just making God madder and madder.
Testify!
With no special abilities and wildly unbalanced stats, Pascal's Wager lands squarely in F tier despite its popularity. In
yeah.
D tier, we have the ontological argument. There are several forms of
Oh,
this, so I'll address the
ontology. Oh my
first
God.
Anselm's ontological argument. It goes like this: God is the greatest possible being that can be imagined.
Right?
God exists as an idea in the mind. A being that exists both in reality and the mind is greater than one which only exists in the mind. If God only exists as a concept in our mind, then we can imagine something that is greater than God, a greatest
Right.
possible being that does exist. We can't imagine something that is greater than the greatest possible being we can imagine, therefore, God exists. Yeah, that one is a pretty wild
Yeah.
ride, so in
So
case
you,
you're confused on
for ontology is it's a philosophical realm where you can just say and do whatever the fuck you want as long as you can bullshit your way through. Ontology is so like ontology is so weird, but I think that that argument it holds some validity, but it's just also just it's too wordy. It's too dumb in my opinion. So because you can't fathom anything greater than God, I can do that right now. God 2.0. He has all the powers. He has all the power that God has, except he can also erase God. You know, is that's greater than God? So I don't know, man. I don't know if I believe in the ontological view of God's
ontological arguments
existence.
essentially boil down to saying a greatest possible being exists somewhere, a necessary criteria for the highest possible greatness is existence, therefore, a greatest possible being, God, exists. This argument commits the fallacy of begging the question, as its conclusion is already included within one of its premises.
Right.
Its first premise says that a greatest possible being
Has
exists,
to
and
exist. Right.
eventually concludes that a greatest possible being
Exists.
exists. It claims God exists after simply defining God as existent. The ontological argument relies upon its decent refutation resistance stat. It deceptively appears complex, giving the impression that its
But it's just
refutation would
wordy.
also need to be complex.
Exactly.
It
No,
still
it's
does
it's
not
kind of
hide its
bullshit.
fallacies well, however, so it ultimately makes poor use of its confusability. Like Pascal's wager, this argument's strength is also its downfall. It's rather unintuitive, and its wordiness makes it difficult to communicate to others. Because of this, it's most often used in its syllogistic form by apologists. Given that its only decent stat and ability ultimately backfire, making it difficult to use, Anselm's ontological argument
L
only
theory. L
makes it to
theory.
D tier. On to C tier, where we find the Kalam cosmological argument. This argument is very popular among Christian and Muslim apologists, as well as many theists
Kalam
with a more
cosmological. I
cursory
don't think I've
knowledge of
heard this one.
apologetics. The Kalam states, whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. That's all of it. Other arguments are often used in conjunction with the Kalam in order to support the idea of a specific God, but still, the Kalam is well recognized as an argument for theism. Strangely
Hmm.
enough, this supposed argument for God is not actually about any deity at all. Even if the entire argument was granted, it still wouldn't support theism. Further, even if granted, it wouldn't establish that the universe's cause.
Yeah, I'll say that one is a bit weird. So basically, that there had to be a cause to the universe, and the universe is here. Therefore, it's kind of like the ontological view if you think about it. You know, there has to be a greatest being, and there can't be anything greater than the greatest being. Therefore, God is the greatest being, meaning God exists. It's like someone had to create the universe, and obviously the universe is here. It was created. So God created the universe because none of us could have did it. It's like, no, it could have been a scientific event that created it. And then that explains the existence of the universe and the creation point of the universe. And then I guess the counter argument is, well, there can't be something before nothing, how can there be a scientific event that happens when there was nothing around? It's like, okay, well, there could have been something outside of our universe that we're not able to observe yet that caused our universe. There could be a bigger outside universe that we just cannot perceive, understand, or even see because we haven't gotten to that level yet as human beings, or just in general. Maybe you have to have a strong spiritual sense to see the next universe or something, you know?
Was itself uncaused. The Kalam, if true, would only establish that the universe had a cause, but would say nothing at all about the nature of that cause.
Right.
Proponents of this argument will often state that the Big Bang was the beginning of all space, time, and matter, and thus the beginning of causation. Therefore, the cause of the Big Bang must have been uncaused itself. This misunderstands the Big Bang, though. See, we don't exactly understand the Big Bang to be the beginning of all that is. It isn't the moment where something came from nothing, as some mistakenly assert. We've traced the expansion of the universe backward, and the Big Bang is simply the point where our understanding of the laws of physics no longer makes sense and we can't trace back any further.
Correct.
So, yeah, the Kalam cosmological argument fails.
The laws of physics have bounds,
much less any deity.
Boundaries we probably just don't understand.
Easy to communicate, giving it an edge over the ontological argument. It also has greater fallacy aversion and refutation resistance than Pascal's wager, although
I agree.
It's not really saying much.
Pascal's wager is trash.
Feature is its ease of communication in its syllogistic form. It isn't confusing.
But then again, so is the ontological
perspective. It
perspective.
sounds smart. With low-level but not terrible stats or abilities, the Kalam cosmological argument lands in C tier. Okay,
but that's
now
the
we're
crib
getting
sign. Let me stop.
some fight in them. In B tier, we have the argument most often used to justify bigotry toward non-believers, the moral argument or argument from morality. There are several forms of this argument, but a common syllogistic form nowadays is this. If God does not exist, objective moral values don't exist. Objective moral values exist, therefore God exists. This argument's first premise is unsubstantiated. It doesn't demonstrate that the only way objective moral values can exist is if God exists. This is simply a non sequitur. Some who use this argument may define objective moral values as moral values declared by God, but
that's something that I sort of grappled with, especially when I was in high school. It was like, okay, if there is no God, if there is no ultimate punishment, there is no ultimate goal, then there essentially is no real reason to act in a morally positive way or morally good way. There's no reason to try to be good, you know, because what is good? It's a condition of what other humans are telling me are good to please this ultimate end goal, which if that ultimate end goal doesn't exist, I'm doing this all for no reason. I can be as bad as possible and I'll just deal with the consequences that humans have to face me, or I'll act as evilly as I can as long as I'm able to navigate through the human punishments that come with it. But then it ignores the fact that there are natural punishments that come with being a bad person, or like there's natural bad energy that follows you when you constantly pick the bad choice or you constantly make bad decisions. But then the counter argument to that is, well, there are a lot of bad people who go their whole lives avoiding, you know, punishment from the good. And it's like the only way there could be real retribution or punishment or justification of that is the fact that there are a lot of good people that don't get any reward at all, or there's no God. You know, and there has to, if you believe that there has to be a benefit or a balance, I should say, then it's either acknowledging that there is a God who's going to ultimately balance everything out in the end, or that the only way that there can be moral bad is that there's an equal amount of moral good, which I don't believe that to be the case at all. But again, obviously I'm not some super genius L-Wi-Fi, so I could be wrong.
The argument state its conclusion within its second premise. That would commit the fallacy of begging the question. The argument would be circular reasoning. God exists because God ordained moral values exist because God exists, and so on. Some other moral arguments, such as C.S. Lewis' argument in Mere Christianity, state that moral law has not been shown to have a natural origin, so it must have come from a supernatural moral lawgiver. First of all, this is an argument from ignorance. Not knowing does not excuse asserting an unsubstantiated answer.
I agree.
Second, evolution by natural selection is actually a pretty good explanation for why social species would behave according to practices which promote fairness, peace, and well-being among groups. This argument is similarly intuitive, communicable, and fallacy-averse to the Kalam cosmological argument. What sets this argument apart is its higher refutation resistance aided by its special ability, Denigrate. While not always fully taken advantage of, the Denigrate ability is used when this argument's user asserts that non-theists lack morals because they lack a belief in a god.
Which is just
This,
not
to
true.
many, makes non-theists appear untrustworthy when they try to debunk the moral argument. After all, an amoral, godless liar probably would try to convince people that God doesn't dictate morality or doesn't even exist. That way, they can get away with all of their evil actions undisturbed. With mid-level...
That's kind of like straw manning, though. That's like straw manning the whole argument. It's like, well, you don't have any morals, so who are you to say that morals don't exist? It's like, well, I cannot believe in God and also have morals. I can not believe that God exists and be an overall moral person. But of course, an immoral person would want people to believe that there's no God, because then they can do immoral things and justify it by the fact that there's no God to correct them. Okay, well, I don't agree with immoral things happening, and I don't believe in God. You know what I'm saying? Or you could just be making that argument because you don't want to. It's just going to go back and forth, where you're just trying to degrade my character rather than degrade my argument, which is kind of bullshit, to be honest. So I don't think it even should be B tier. I would say C tier.
And an occasionally effective special ability, the moral argument goes in B tier. I already know that my A and S tiers are going to be hotly contested, but I think my cases for these are pretty solid. In A tier, we have arguments from personal experience. I know, I'm sure plenty of you take issue with that, but please hear me out until the end. Arguments from personal experience aren't usually presented in syllogisms, but if they were, they'd probably go something like this. My personal experiences are reliable sources of information. I personally experienced, insert God claim here, therefore, the God claim is true. There are several issues with the first premise here. Personal experiences are not always reliable. One, personal experiences can contradict reality. There are hallucinations, manic states, meditative or trance states, psychoses, and more that can inform delusions. There's a wealth of scientific evidence that shows this to be true.
Correct, yeah.
Two, different people's personal experiences often contradict each other. Just ask all the Muslims, all the Christians, all the Hindus who have all had personal experiences in which a god confirms to them that following their specific religion is the only way. Three, and perhaps most importantly, a plethora of cognitive biases exist which influence perfectly sane, healthy, and honest people to misinterpret their mundane, naturalistic experiences all the time. Two fallacies are very common among interpretations of personal experience. The first is thinking that one thing caused another just because they happened in sequence. This is drawing false correlation, or post hoc ergo propter hoc.
Well, one thing I will say is, like, I feel like the more, and this is probably why there's a larger presence of atheism amongst scientists, the more logical you begin to think about things, the less the need to believe in God is there. You know what I mean? It's like, once you acknowledge that humans act irrationally because our source of emotions are in our brain, which is something that humans have already scientifically acknowledged that don't really make sense. So all of the little synapses that are firing off and sending electrons through your brain, and those are what create your emotion, right? So then the whole moral argument goes out the window, because normally your morality is what controls your emotions. If you're a good person, you're more than likely going to act on those good things. And if you do something bad, then it's probably because at the moment you weren't able to control the level of emotions in your brain and you acted immorally, right? So you can combine those two things with science, where it's like you believe this and you have a certain level of activity in your brain, and therefore that explains your actions, right? And then you can extrapolate that to animals. Well, if there's a God that believes in free will, what about animals? Well, animals were put here for the benefit of humans. So therefore, morally, humans are more important on a moral standard than animals because we were given free will. Then that takes away from the morality argument in and of itself, because you're making one entity more important than the other entity, despite the fact that it's a living, breathing creature. And if God created all living, breathing creatures the same, or equal, I should say, not the same, equally, then there is none that is more important than the other. They all contribute to the importance of each other. So it's like, there's a lot of contradictions in the theological argument, and the more you get interested in science, the more you get interested in understanding science, the less of a need you have for believing in God. But of course, there are a lot of scientists that believe in God. I don't want to take away from that or say that it's, God doesn't exist. But I just feel like the more logical you become,
The second
the
is
less you have to
positing an
rely on
unsubstantiated
theological arguments.
explanation for an occurrence just because you can't explain it otherwise. This is an argument from ignorance. So, with all these flaws in this argument, why do I put it in A tier? It has the absolute best intuitiveness and refutation-resistant states out of any argument for God. Human beings naturally trust their personal experience. It is, after all, the primary source we use to inform countless decisions on a day-to-day basis. This means that even well-educated, intelligent people often trust their personal experiences over more reliable sources like scientific data all the time. If someone has a gripping...
And if you just think about that statement, like human beings naturally trust their personal experiences more than anything else, it makes perfect sense, right? So when you think about the brain, you've got the brain stem, there's like the fist analogy, the brain stem, and then you've got the amygdala, right? And that's where you get your fight or flight responses, right? You have the immediate, what you experience is going to directly change the brain stem and the amygdala to believe or to adjust to certain situations so that they don't happen again, so you're not put into danger, or to escape dangerous situations. So if you experience a situation where it's like, boom, I almost died and I experienced God, and he told me that, this is the only way to believe. Well, if I believe in him, I won't experience near death anymore, or I won't be afraid of the near death anymore. So it's a response to the brain stem and the amygdala experiencing this horrifying thing that it never wants to experience again. And then it changes so that at your prefrontal cortex here, now when you're of age and you're able to make rational, logical decision making, you're going to already have those things in the back of your brain, back here. So if you experience something, again, dramatic, after that first godly experience, you're going to fall back on the concept of, well, if I just have enough faith and I believe in God enough, I can get through this. And that's how most religious people live their life, which is kind of interesting to think about, like how the scientific aspects of the brain play into believing
personal
God.
Experience related to God, they're probably going to believe it regardless of who they are. Personal experience is also incredibly hard to refute, given that it isn't possible to place oneself within another person's experience in order to point out any definite logical fallacies being made. On top of that, augmenting its refutation resistance, this argument may have the strongest special ability there is, attaching to identity. See, if you attempt to argue with the interpretation of someone's personal experience, they often take it as a personal attack as they associate that personal experience with their very identity as a person.
Exactly.
The personal defenses go up, rendering any further debate entirely useless.
If you think about it, that's why Islam is one of the strongest, or if not the strongest religion on the planet, because I believe, you think about like the Crusades in terms of Christianity. That's where the last sort of instance where you see people actually fight wars and die for Christianity. But in more modern times, Islam has sort of taken that over. Because when you think about what they stand for, they are the religion that they will die for their religion nowadays. Christianity has begun to bend its entire belief system to include people and to try to cater to the needs of people. Whereas Islam is a lot less tolerant of beliefs that contradict their religion or that go against the ancient ways that they used to practice, which is why people say it's the most intolerant religion and also it's the strongest one. So that's pretty interesting. Wi-Fi, bro. Why does it got load every time?
Argument has low fallacy aversion, but because of how convincing it is given its other stats, that doesn't really matter. Its real weakness is its lack of communicability. Personal testimonies do sway some, but for the most part, those who value personal experience aren't strongly convinced of things from hearing about other people's experiences. Many theistic groups have learned to compensate for this weakness, however, in creating environments which are conducive for personal experiences with God. Think prayer and fasting sessions, physically intense rituals, communal worship, and group excursions. If you still doubt that this argument belongs in A tier, go ask a few theists why they believe, then ask them if they would still believe if the reason they gave was not at play. If they say they'd still believe, repeat those questions until they say no or refuse to go any further. This is a street epistemology technique for figuring out why people believe what they do. My bet is that you land on personal experience that way the majority of the time. With extremely high intuitiveness stats, an overpowered special ability, and solid strategy to compensate for its weaknesses, arguments from personal experience earn a solid spot
I
in A
see.
tier.
Okay, that's what I was
Finally, we're
wondering.
up to
How is
S tier,
personal
where only the
experience
most
A
effective
tier?
arguments belong. At this tier, I'm going to place the teleological argument, specifically the argument from fine-tuning. It goes like this. Cosmology shows us that there are several physical constants that govern the universe as we know it. If any one of those were tweaked even the smallest bit, the universe as we know it would not exist. The constants as they stand form a proverbial Goldilocks zone for our existence. It's highly improbable that this would occur by chance without a fine-tuning creator, so it's more probable that a creator does exist and is responsible for this fine-tuning. While this seems to make sense at first, deeper inspection reveals this argument's simple flaws. First, it makes use of a false dichotomy, presenting pure chance and an intelligent creator as the only two possibilities.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, to dissect that one a little bit, right? So basically, the argument is okay. The probability that this all happened by luck, that human beings were orchestrated by complete luck, is so low that the probability that there's somebody who has complete control over the cosmological events and the current standards of the universe that are in place for human beings to even exist overrule that of the probability that this is all by chance. My counter argument is that we know that human beings and beings in general evolved from their circumstances. Therefore, if there were tweaks, if there were changes in the historical events of human beings, we might not be the same versions of ourselves that are here today, but we would still be a version of ourselves. We would either, there might have been a small tweak that meant that human beings had blue skin, but would that change the fact that humans still believed in a god? Would that change the fact that we still were dependent on animals to consume, to eat? Or if there was a change in the cosmological events to make it so that, the law of physics that exists, that you don't need, energy cannot either be created or destroyed, simply recycled, then if that was no longer the case, well, humans wouldn't need to eat animals, and overpopulation would be, you see what I'm saying? Like, everything would change, but does that mean that we still wouldn't have beings around? Because God isn't here simply to explain the existence of humans. He's here to explain the existence of the entire universe. So yes, humans might not have existed if cosmological events were tweaked or changed, but the universe itself might still exist, just with different standards. Is sort of what I was trying to get at there. I don't know if I explained that properly or not. Li-Fi.
When it hasn't successfully ruled out other options, there could perhaps be some purely physical rule to the universe which demands that these constants be the way they are. Second, this is an argument from ignorance. Because the arguer doesn't know how such an unlikely thing could have possibly happened, they posit an unsubstantiated explanation,
Correct.
a god, instead of saying, I don't know. This argument has high balance stats. Its intuitiveness is second only to personal experience. Research within the field of cognitive psychology suggests that teleological thinking naturally occurs even in children. Humans naturally conclude that there is intent behind the function of just about everything, living,
Right.
non-living, inanimate, or not. This type of argument is so intuitive that most cultures around the world have come up with some form of it independently. It's also very communicable, as it lends itself to colorful analogies like the watchmaker analogy, and it spawns stories that become religious dogma, aka creation myths. One of its special abilities results from its high communicability and decent refutation resistance. That ability is giving purpose. It gives its user a feeling of uniqueness, privilege status, or purpose. The user thinks that they
Yeah.
were designed intently by an intelligent creator. This makes challenging the argument difficult, as any challenges may trigger the user's personal defenses. Those
Facts.
challenges will appear to the user as attacks on their personal sense of purpose, as assertions of hopeless nihilism, or both. This argument also has the ability to
It's
retreat
got
to
2
gaps
special
in the knowledge
abilities?
of any who would try to refute it. If a teleological argument is used on the level of biology and evolution is invoked to refute it, it may retreat to the level of chemistry, then physics, then cosmology as a whole, always avoiding direct refutation. As long as there's something about the existence of the
Shifting the
universe that we
goalposts.
don't know, this
This is
argument
the
lies
destiny
safely
argument.
in that ignorance. Even when this argument has been debunked, it won't appear so to many. The refutation of this argument demands that its opponent admit ignorance, which can appear to some on the argument's side as an admission of defeat. Given its high
Got you.
intuitiveness, its ability to turn its fallacy into a cheap victory to some, its incredible communicability, and its refutation-resisting ability of turning any challenge into an attack on its user's existential security, the teleological argument belongs in S tier. So, if you're intent on
Wow.
convincing someone that God exists, hopefully you now better understand some of the tools at your disposal. Although, if you're like me and feel that the more you've come to understand about apologetics, the less comfortable you are actually using them, then at least consider, for a moment, getting out of this game altogether.
I mean, are you encouraging people to not believe in God, my guy? No, I'm joking. No, that was very, very interesting. I think the ontological perspective should have been F tier. I don't think it had any basis. It actually made less sense than any of the other perspectives, in my opinion. But I do see how the teleological perspective or theory can hold such a strong basis, especially in our reality, because it's just so unbelievable that us as human beings even exist. And then to just attribute that to chance, it just seems like you're sort of like giving up on the fact that you have any influence in things or that you can change anything. It's sort of like things have already been rolled into place for you. You know what I mean? Where it gets into the what is it called? It's like pre-something perspective where you just everything is already laid out for you. You can't really control the way that your life. If you're a bad person, it's because God made you that way, and you're destined to be a bad predestination, predisposition, something like that. But yeah, basically like you're destined to be who you are already. You don't have any real influence over that, so you shouldn't work to be a good person, because if God wanted you to be evil, He already created you that way. And that train of thinking is just also just laced with fallacies. So yeah, I think this was very, very interesting. I really enjoyed that. That was really nice just to talk about, the existence of God and some of the perspectives that exist, and exactly how we can go about navigating taking them down if we ever come up with somebody who tries to like influence us, or we want to have just like a debate or a discussion with a friend or something. But that's very, very interesting.